story. So this is from a website called Safaria, which is a wonderfully useful site because not only does it have the complete text in Hebrew and in English, and you can actually choose which English translation you want to display. So you can do that. You can also look at only the English text or only the Hebrew text. It offers, if you click on a particular verse, all kinds of commentaries that are available about that particular passage. So it's really a wonderful resource. Again, Safaria.org, building on that Hebrew word we just learned, Sefer, as a book. Okay, so this Torah portion, and most Torah portions, by the way, begin with a word that becomes the name of the Torah portion. It may not have anything to do with the content of the Torah portion. It's just one of the first words in that first verse. So here the first word is Vayera, and appeared. So it says, and appeared is the name of the Torah portion. Now, right away at the very first verse, your either heresy or evolution of theology radar should ping, because it says, Yahweh appeared to him by the terebinths of Mamre. What? I thought you couldn't see God, right? When Moses is on the mountain, God covers him with his hand because you can't see the face of God and live. The priest who goes into the temple in Jerusalem has this incense cloud to cover in case God is there. Well, here it says God appears to Abraham. But God appears as three figures standing near him. Uh-oh. One God, three figures. Again, a Christian reading might read that differently. A Jewish reading says it's just sort of a manifestation of the divine presence in some way. So what does Abraham do here? He demonstrates a value. And the value here is hospitality. What do you do when guests come? This will come back to play in chapter 19, as we'll see. So he greets them, he bows to the ground, he refers to them as Adonai, my Lord. This is not the substitute for Yahweh, Adonai, but in this case, there's an interesting parallel there. And he has very kind of obsequious language. This is, again, the Hebrew. Imna matzati chen be'enecha. If I pray, I have found, I pleased you, or I'm pleasant in your eyes. Al na ta'avor me'al avdecha. Do not, please, I pray you, leave from your servant. Go on past. So it's very sort of a flattering, obsequious kind of language, but that's the hospitality message. Again, a subtlety you get in the Hebrew phrasing, those nas endings, and your servant is very inviting. And so he offers to bathe their feet, to recline under the tree, to feed them some. And they say, okay, do what you said. So he runs in the tent of Sarah and he says, make cakes, knead these ugot, these cakes out of choice flour. He ran to the herd and took a calf, gave it to a servant boy to prepare. He took curds and milk, that's cottage cheese, we would say today, and the calf that had been prepared and put them before them. Do you notice the problem? Uh-oh. We've got milk and we've got meat in one meal. Now, the rabbinic lens would look at this and say, obviously, he waited 3 hours after serving the dairy before he served the meat. Of course. The historical mind would say that the milk and meat prohibition was not part of Jewish life when this story was written, because he's clearly serving them milk with meat. But also notice on the value side, the importance of this hospitality. You know, killing a calf before it's full grown to a cow, that's a sacrifice to get more tender meat in a herding culture. And it's a very generous sacrifice to these random strangers that just happen by. I mean, look at all the work they're doing. The dairy and the curds and the calf and the cakes that Sarah's baking. I mean, this is a clear core value for this culture that's describing this. The men then say to him, where is Sarah, your wife? He doesn't say, how did you know her name was Sarah? He says, she's there in the tent. One says, I will return to you next year and she will have a son. Now, they were old, advanced in years. Now, this is, again, a translation thing. Sarah had stopped having her period. The Hebrew is more euphemistic. It says she had stopped Orach Nashim, the way of women, the path of women. So they are less explicit in this. Sarah laughs to herself. Now, here again is a case where the Hebrew opens a window for you. The first word in this verse is vatitzchak. She laughed. But if you know Hebrew, Yitzchak is the name of Isaac. So Yitzchak, she laughs to herself, is already an allusion to someone who knows the story. And in an oral culture story, you're telling the stories over and over again that Isaac is on the way. It's being foreshadowed by the fact that she laughs here when she hears the news that this is going to happen. Really? With my husband so old and me? Then Yahweh, or the people who are there, however you want to read that, say to Abraham and saying, why did she laugh? Is anything impossible for Yahweh? I'll return at the same season and she'll have a son. And Sarah lied. Uh-oh. What about the 10 Commandments? Thank goodness they haven't been given yet, right? You don't have to worry. She said, I did not laugh, lo tzachakti, because she was frightened. Now, there's a play here as well in the Hebrew, because remember the first word, Vayera? Here it says that she was afraid. And the word for fear is also yira, yud resh aleph. So the story begins with these people were seen, and now she's afraid that they might see through her, and see that she was laughing. But she says, no, I did not laugh. And then the reply came, tzachakt, you did laugh. And so they left, and they looked down on the city of Sodom, which is where Abraham's nephew Lot is living. Now, when you say Sodom in English, you think of this concept of sodomy or sodomites, specifically relating to homosexual male sex, or in some states and legal codes, any kind of unnatural, unusual sex, which could include what we would call oral sex or anal sex of heterosexual couples. It doesn't have to be gay sex at all, but it's basically unnatural and it's related to sex. However, the story of Sodom, as we'll see, is not only about that. But what I wanted to highlight in chapter 18 is what happens next. Because Yahweh, that same Yahweh that just visited and promised Sarah would have a child, says to himself, almost in an aside that we get to listen to, should I hide from Abraham what I'm going to do, since Abraham will become a great nation and everyone will bless themselves by him? I've singled him out to instruct his children to keep in the way of Yahweh, to do what is just and what is right, in order for Yahweh to bring about for Abraham what was promised. So what does this mean? Why is he checking with Abraham? Well, you could read it as he's testing Abraham. Is he going to give me the right answer? He could be teaching Abraham, this is an ethical dilemma, and how do you reason through it? Or maybe he's looking for advice. Even the authors of this text didn't have a God image that was the perfect all-knowing God of Maimonidean medieval Jewish philosophy. Their God is like the Greek gods that make mistakes and that sometimes get insight from human beings. And so it may be that Yahweh the God wants to check with Abraham and see what he thinks on the situation. So he begins, the outrage of Sodom and Gomorrah is so great, their sin is so grave. I will go down and see if they've acted according to the outcry that has reached me, like I've gotten reports. I will take note. And what does it mean, I will take note? It means gone. And so now Abraham decides to stand up. He doesn't say, okay. He doesn't say whatever. He doesn't say, your will be done. He says, Tispeit Sadiqim Rasha, you will sweep away a righteous person with a wicked person? Okay, there are bad people there. But are you really going to collectively punish everybody, even the righteous that are there? What if there are 50 innocent people in the city? Would you wipe them all out and not forgive it for the sake of the 50? Khalila, far from you to do this, to bring death on the innocent and the guilty, for the innocent and guilty fare alike. Far be it from you. And this is the best line. Hashofet ol haaretz lo ya'aseh mishpat. Should not the judge of all the earth do justice, deal justly? This is why when I do programs on Jewish heretics, I start with Abraham. Because Abraham pushes back on God and says, shouldn't you do justice? This doesn't sound like justice to me. He's challenging God, not just saying, yes, sir. Yahweh answered, okay, if I find 50 innocent people, I'll forgive the whole place for their sake. And now Abraham speaks up again, and again you get that kind of obsequious language. My Lord, I am but dust and ashes. Who am I to speak up? But what if we're missing 5 people? What if you only have 45? Yahweh says, okay, I won't destroy it for 45. Well, so you see the haggling starts. Don't you want to haggle? He does. What if there's only 40 there? Okay. What if there's only 30 there? Okay. I'll dare again to speak. What if there's only 20 there? Okay. And finally, let not my Lord be angry if I speak one last time. What if there's only 10? I will not destroy for the sake of the 10. The end. So Yahweh leaves and Abraham returns to his place. So here we have a model of Abraham as the confidant of Yahweh, but also a challenger of Yahweh who pushes back. Now, chapter 19 has more problematic ethics from a humanistic perspective. Again, these are all non-historical events. This is part of the mythology of the beginning of the Hebrew peoples. Now, Lot, as Abraham's nephew, has been given a good ethical education. When he sees the visitors, now there are 2 messengers who show up. He rises up to greet them. He bows to his face to the ground. Again, he uses that obsequious language. Please, my lords, turn aside to your servant's house to spend the night and bathe your feet and be on your way. They say, nah, we'll sleep out in the square. He knows better because he knows his neighbors in Stone. He gets them to come in with him, and he prepares a feast for them and cooks unleavened bread, matzot, because it's fast and they can eat fast, and so they eat. But they not let laying down when the town council and militia of Sodom, the people, the army, so to speak, of Sodom, all of them, the influential and the insignificant, gathered around the house. They shouted to Lot and said, where are the ones who came to you tonight? Hotziem, bring them out, alenu, to us, v'neda otam, and we will know them. If you know biblical euphemisms, to know someone, isn't that a song? To know him is to love. Well, love is the wrong word, but that's the point. To know someone in the biblical carnal sense is what they want. Lot goes out to the entrance and shuts the door, and he says, I beg you, my friends, do not commit such a wrong against the rules of hospitality and male dignity. And I say male dignity on purpose. Look, Lot says, I have 2 daughters who have not known a man. Let me bring them out to you, and you may do to them as you please. But do not do anything to the others, since they have come under the shelter of my roof. I am hard put to choose a less ethical statement in the Torah. More violating of human conventions, of respect for your own family, of guarding your own children. I have 2 daughters who've never known a man. Take them and do whatever you want. And I know what you want. But don't bother these guests who are here. Is it a difficult situation? No doubt. Is this the right answer? Strong doubt. In the end, they say, nope, we want the people that came and we will attack you as well. So now the agents, these are the angels that are sent by Yahweh, they bring Lot into the house and strike the people blind so they can't find anything. And they say it's time to go. So they flee the city. They are told, don't look back at the city as it's struck. And so they flee, taking what little they can. Do not look behind, flee to the hills. I'm just going to skim forward a bit. He asks to go to a settlement called Zoar, and they flee there first. And then in verse 24, Yahweh rains down upon Sodom and Amorah, on Sodom and Gomorrah, sulfurous fire from out of heaven, annihilating those cities and the entire plain, and all the inhabitants of the cities, and all the vegetation of the ground. And Lot's wife looks back, and she becomes a pillar of salt. And that tells you why this story is here. There's a part in the land of Israel called the Dead Sea Valley, which is one of the driest, deepest places on earth that's above, that's not in the ocean. It is dry, it is desolate, nothing grows there. And the major body of water there, which is a tributary lake that comes from the Jordan River, is called, in English, the Dead Sea, but in Hebrew, Yam HaMelach, the Salt Sea. So it's not an accident that there's this huge desert there, and there's a big body of water that's full of salt with all these salt deposits as it's evaporating. And then this story says his wife looked back. We don't get her name. It's just Eshet Lot, the wife of Lot. She looks back and voila, turns to salt. It's explaining why that land is the way it is. It was a punishment from Yahweh for this sin of violating hospitality. There's one last detail I want to highlight in 19 and then turn it over to Jonathan to look at 22. And that is, Lot leaves this area of Zoar and goes to settle in the hill country. He was afraid there, and they lived in a cave. The older daughter says to the younger, our father is old, and there is no man on earth left who consort with us in the way of the world. That's, again, to know them. More importantly, to have children through them. They think they're the only people left in the world. All they've seen is destroyed. So we'll make our father drink wine, and we'll lie with him, and then we will maintain life through our father. So they made him drunk, and the older one went and lay down, and he didn't realize what was going on. And the next day, they did the same thing, and the younger one lay down with the father and then came back up, and thus they became pregnant from their father. This is also one of those joke lines in Hebrew. The word for pregnancy in Hebrew is beherayon, which is based on the word har, which means hill or mountain. You become hilly when you become pregnant. That's the shape of things. They became pregnant, and then again we get the point of the story. The older one bore a son and named him Moab, from my father, and the younger one bore a son and named him Ben Ami, son of my people. That's the father of the Ammonites. Now, the Moabites and the Ammonites are real peoples that we know lived on the east bank of the River Jordan. We found them. We found some of their archives and libraries and archaeological ruins. But they didn't tell this story, that they were descended from incest, that they were really bastards, right? No. This is a political genealogy written by the Hebrews, who are the enemies of the Ammonites and the Moabites. It's saying those jerks were bastards from the beginning. It's not history. It doesn't tell us about the origins of Moab in the time of Abraham. It does tell us about the politics and the rivalries at the time the story was being written. So it's more of a clue to when it was written than it is a clue of what was happening in the time frame it claims to be describing. That's that historical lens to bring through. But you can imagine reading this story from a feminist lens, right? The use of women, the use of the daughters. You could read it through an LGBTQ lens and the prescription of homosexual behavior, or the depiction of it as inherently violent and violative. You can read the moral side and the ethical side of how Lot responds to the situation, or how Abraham negotiates with God. It really offers many opportunities that are totally appropriate to a humanistic approach to Jewish life as a product of Jewish culture, but also as an opportunity for us to clarify our own values and to grapple with Jewish history. And last thing, you are also allowed to look at what the rabbis had to say about it, how they commented on it, what their interpretations were. And sometimes they'll be right and have really good insight, and sometimes they'll be flat wrong. I remember when reading this story in a graduate school class, I read the Rashi commentary. And Rashi's a rabbinic commentator who lived around 1000 of the Common Era in the Rhine Valley between what is today France and Germany. And he wrote a comment that normally when girls have their first sexual experience, they're not able to get pregnant. But in this case, the daughters were able to hold themselves in a certain way, so they were able to get pregnant. I hope your children know that they can get pregnant the first time women can get pregnant the first time they have sex. Rashi was wrong. Now, other times he has a very insightful comment into the use of language or the historical context or connecting to other stories and laws. In this case, he was factually wrong. And there was an Orthodox Jewish woman in our class who had gone to Jewish day school, and her response to me was, "You must be wrong. You must have read Rashi wrong. Rashi can't be wrong. You must be." But the reality is Rashi was wrong. And so I brought a copy of the text, and the next week she said, "Why do you care so much?" I don't care so much. I just don't want to be called wrong when I'm right. And that's the dance of reading the rabbinic commentary. It's their view on the text. It is not the view on the text. We are also entitled to have our own commentary. With that, I will turn it over to Jonathan.
All right, thank you. I just want to say one thing about the negotiating down that Abraham does in this story. I also had a bar mitzvah student who was interested in hostage negotiations. He was reading a book by like a former FBI hostage negotiator, and I thought, how can we, relate this to a Torah portion? And we settled on that particular story. So again, when you're not viewing God as perfect and infallible, there's a way to view that story as God basically has these cities held hostage, and Abraham's using a lot of what modern interrogators will use in terms of their technique, the flattery, I understand how you feel, the negotiating down, how about you release this number of people, that number of people, and ultimately kind of solves the situation. However, in the biblical story, God destroys the cities anyway, so that's just another thing. From a historical reading, if we're talking about textual analysis and so forth, it could have been that there was a version of that story where the cities were saved, and then another version where they were destroyed and they were kind of mashed up, as things tend to be in the Torah. So we can look at them separately. And, we could do that with this portion as well, or this section of the portion as well, which I think is familiar.
I just want to add in, there's one comment in the chat box. And again, you're welcome to add those. Risa points out, if you're a survivalist, going up in the mountains to survive when everything else is gone, and maybe that's attractive, or it's something you expect to do,
or
having to make
survivalist commentary. Yeah.
Right.
Very interesting. So this section is a little more familiar probably to most people, and I may not go verse by verse. This is the Akedah, the story of the binding of Isaac. It's familiar in part because, for whatever reason, and there are reasons, it is traditionally the portion read on Rosh Hashanah, which, part of me thinks is kind of funny, just because historically, Rosh Hashanah is one of the few times of the year that ordinary Jews might show up to synagogue who might not otherwise. And here you are sitting through this, again, traditionally very long service and hearing perhaps one of the most problematic, or according to some, the most problematic stories in all of our Torah. And that's like the one story that you hear during the year. So, part of that, by the way, we can actually view as a humanistic lesson as well if we wanted to. There's just my own kind of idiosyncratic rationale for this. First of all, historically, one of the reasons why the rabbis chose to include this story for Rosh Hashanah is because of the reference to the ram who becomes a surrogate sacrifice instead of Isaac. And then, of course, the shofar. And the shofar is a very important connective piece when we're talking about relating what will develop as Rosh Hashanah to the very bare minimum that's mentioned in the Torah, sort of the basis of the holiday, which is largely a shofar holiday. But one of the things that's interesting about this story, I think, just reading it in a Rosh Hashanah context, if your community does that, or if you have a tradition of doing that, if the holiday of Rosh Hashanah is about making amends, um, owning up to our failures and so forth, then maybe the message is that look at Abraham, who's revered in history, revered in our culture. Really, all three major Western religions revere him. And yet he messes up pretty bad in this story. And so if he can mess up that bad and still be revered, then so can you, right? Which is kind of a Rosh Hashanah message. You made mistakes and you can atone. But that's not what I want to talk about with this portion. What I would like to talk about is something kind of interesting that also happens in the Hebrew that gives us a possible insight into a reading of this text that might not be so conventional. So, as Adam was alluding to, the rabbinic commentaries, whether they're Talmudic or Maimonides or Rashi or whomever, they typically give Abraham a pass or apologize for his almost sacrificing his son, which is what happens in the story. In general, the rabbinic authorities are reticent to criticize the actions of these kinds of characters, certainly Abraham being such an important patriarch. And so some commentaries will say that God never actually intended Isaac to be a burnt offering. If you read some of the Hebrew, there's some ambiguity in terms of what is being called. Maybe Abraham missed the message. Maybe he misread what was being required of him. Along those lines, others just say that Abraham was supposed to raise up Isaac, not to kill him, just sort of put him on the altar and show him off, I guess, that sort of thing. But, the main thrust of the commentary is actually to look at Abraham as the perfect exemplar of piety, sort of the role model of someone who is so committed to this monotheistic project, so to speak, that he'll do anything as if that's a good thing. So then the question is, from a humanistic standpoint, is that such a good thing? And in fact, some of the piyutim, the liturgical poems that will start to come out like in the 8th century, 7th century, will start to question this very thing. They'll be told in the voice of Isaac, saying, Dad, this might seem like a good idea in the moment, but there will be consequences. Or looking at it from the perspective of Sarah, the wife of Abraham, saying, you're not being a good father, just to sort of summarize what the message would be in there. So there is, even within like traditional commentaries or liturgy, some pushback against what's going on in this story. So it's never been, I don't think, fully embraced in the sense that this is a completely virtuous story. Otherwise, there wouldn't be all of that defense of Abraham and also all of the criticisms ultimately of Abraham as well that we see in the traditional literature. So that being said, I just want to, Adam, if you can just move along here a little bit. So basically in the story, Isaac, by the way, if you're reading it in the context of the Torah, he's 37 years old at this point. That's not really relevant to the story because I think it is a separate story strand that sort of is encompassed in the larger narrative of Abraham and Isaac. So age doesn't matter, so to speak, in this story. Let's just imagine that Isaac is still young and innocent. But Abraham answers the call to take his boy up to the mountain, place him on the altar, and sacrifice him. So the issue, though, that we see is that the one who's doing the calling throughout that portion of the text is actually Ha Elohim. So actually go back a little bit. Sorry, I'm not in charge of this right now. A little bit awkward. But if we go back to the first verse, it says, right there, it's Ha Elohim who is putting Abraham to the test. This is very unusual. So from a literary criticism or really form criticism perspective, we might say that this is an E text, meaning this is, a fragment of text that's written by those who refer to God as Elohim. And that's all well and good. We're going to see a shift later on. But to call God Ha Elohim is exceedingly rare in the Torah and in the Bible generally, in fact. Usually Ha Elohim is reserved for the gods, meaning like the other gods, maybe the gods of the Moabites or the Amorites who were mentioned earlier. Putting the Ha, which is the, in front of Elohim suggests that maybe this isn't the God of Israel that is calling Abraham, and maybe all the translations and interpretations are wrong. Maybe in fact this is the other gods, and he's hearing some random voice who's telling him to do this stuff, but he's so caught up in the moment and so caught up with his own sort of desire to be God's number one guy that he misreads even who is giving the command. And this will become interesting later. And by the way, these insights are not original to me, even though we don't find them in the classical commentaries. There is a book, I'll just put it up on the screen. You could probably see it. Hebrew Humanism. It's an old book. You can see my copy's all worn out. Harris Hirschberg, 1964, kind of an obscure book. Hirschberg was himself a German-trained rabbi who came to the United States in 1939 and led some communities in the greater LA area, Los Angeles area. But he has an interesting take on this. Because later on in the story, we're going to see a little bit of a shift. So if we go to verse 11, after...
I want to just highlight one question that came through in the chat about whether this story is intended to end the practice of child sacrifice, which was common among the Canaanites. And I said, let's put a pin in that because
I'm going to get to that. I'm going to get to that. And sorry, I can't read the comments as I'm.
Yeah. And also, Jonathan will get to the name of the God that halts the sacrifice.
Yeah.
Of
that's what's going on right here in verse 11. So up to this point, Ha Elohim is calling Abraham. Abraham is dutifully responding without any of that negotiation or defense that we saw earlier. So as Adam was saying, when it comes to the protagonist's family, they seem to be more willing to, I don't know what the term would be, screw them over than random people, which is sort of a trend that we see in these stories as well. Maybe a through line in this portion. But right here we see that the one who intervenes actually is not Ha Elohim related, but rather Yud He Vav He related. So it's the messenger Malach Adonai. We see that right there, or Malach Yahweh, Yud He Vav He. And so what Hirschberg says is that, in fact, there is nothing unusual about child sacrifice. Even in the biblical context, we have, first of all, some prohibitions against it. And whenever you see a prohibition against something in the Torah, we know that people are doing it. So right there, we know that human sacrifice was not banned, as it were, among the Israelites, but in fact, they were doing it. And we even have examples of that in the book of Judges and Second Kings and Jeremiah and so forth, that there is actually a practice of human sacrifice among the Israelites. So Hirschberg says that's not actually interesting. That aspect of the story, that interpretation, as Andy's or somebody else is alluding to, maybe it's, anyway, whatever. I can't see the comments. But what I'm saying is somebody was mentioning that, does this have anything to do with ending child sacrifice? That's not really the point of the story. if we're taking the kind of the cultural historical view, the child sacrifice actually didn't end with this story, that it would be a practice that would continue even among the Israelites. It's a bit of a controversial point, but a point nonetheless. Rather, the key here is that if we're reading it just as literature, right? The intervention of the angel of God, the messenger of Yud He Vav He, as it were, where we see that shift in God's name from Ha Elohim, I'll say the gods, to Yud He Vav He, then maybe that's two different authorial strands. That maybe the original story is going to end with Isaac being killed, and then another story has Isaac being saved, or something like that, and they're mashed together, sewn together. Some people say that the Torah is a masterpiece of editing because of this sort of thing, where we see the different voices, the different story traditions sort of being tied together in this way. They could be two different independent stories. And that's what documentary hypothesis might tell us. However, if we just read it as literature, what Rabbi Hirschberg said is that what's the key here is that Abraham was being led astray by this kind of ambiguous other voice, or voices even, of Ha Elohim, the gods, and that it's only when the true voice, so to speak, according to the Bible, of the messenger of Yud He Vav He intervenes, that he finally knocks it off. So the lesson here from that reading would be, don't follow voices. Don't just do things because people tell you to do them, and especially if you think that it's God telling you to do this. In fact, you could get into a lot of trouble. And then in that sense, Abraham actually fails the test, the original test, but he also is rewarded at the end of the story, which you'll see in the translation or the Hebrew, whatever you're reading. He's rewarded, but according, again, to this reading, the reward would be that he didn't carry on. He actually listened to the true voice that intervened, the voice of the messenger of Yud He Vav He, and that's why he ultimately passed the test. He got like two chances, right? Failed the first time by following the wrong voice, and succeeded the second time by not proceeding when he heard the correct voice. Now, why this is especially interesting to me is because there is an episode of Xena the Warrior Princess, first season episode, called Altered States, Altared, sort of a pun, a play on words, Altered States from 1996. And here we have in this story, Xena, who's the warrior princess. Hopefully you've seen the show before. If you haven't, you can find this episode. But basically, Xena in this series, travels through different events in world mythology, and kind of reveals that maybe the gods involved or the characters involved aren't all that they're cracked up to be in the folklore. She became sort of a feminist and even lesbian fixture, a hero in the 90s when she was on television, a role model. But she's kind of cast a skeptical lens on all of these stories. So in this Altered States episode, she actually intervenes in the story of the Akedah, the story of the binding of Isaac. In that story, Isaac is Icus and Abraham is Antius, so the names are changed. But what's really interesting about it is that in the story, Icus is sort of being manipulated, drugged, and other things, and led astray by the brother of Icus, who is Isaac, and that brother is Ma'el, who we know as Ishmael in the Torah story. So behind the scenes, according to the Xena episode, the Ha Elohim, or the other voices that is leading Abraham astray, or Antius in the parallel story in Xena, is actually the jealous brother who had been cast aside in the previous chapter of this story. If you know the story of Hagar and Ishmael, once Sarah is able to have her own child, she's like, get rid of the maidservant and the other son of Abraham because we don't need them anymore. Just to paraphrase what happens in that story. So in the Xena re-envisioning of the story, the brother comes back and manipulates the father into killing, or trying to manipulate the father into killing his brother. Ultimately, Antiochus Abraham does not succeed in killing IISHJ Isaac in that story either. But one of the interesting things in that particular version is you have Ma'el on top of the mountain with like a megaphone saying, Antiochus, take your son, your favorite son, up to the altar and sacrifice him. It's exactly that other voice that Antiochus, being a very pious monotheist, followed without even questioning. And so, what is the moral of the story, perhaps from a humanistic perspective? Value your children over the voices in your head. And in fact, there's a very useful book. And you can probably stop the sharing of the screen if you want.
Okay.
I'll just plug another book. This is called Putting God Second: How to Save Religion from Itself by Rabbi Daniel Hartman, who's a modern Orthodox rabbi, the Hartman Institute, which some of you might be familiar with, but he's very progressive in his view of both Orthodoxy and, Israel and its future and so forth. And the point of this book is that in order to live an ethical life as a Jewish person, specifically, he's talking maybe even more broadly as a person in the Western world, you actually have to put human needs and human dignity and human value ahead of religious belief, ahead of your theology. I actually read this with a class that I was teaching on humanistic philosophy, and the conclusion that the students drew from it was that Hartman was so convincing in putting God second that by the time he got to the point in the book where he said that you should still believe in God, it didn't make any sense. He was just so compelling. But what he would call Abraham in this book is someone who is, let's say, infected with God intoxication. That's the term that Hartman used in this book. And he says this: the moment Abraham hears God's commanding voice, or we'll say the other God's commanding voice, just to be consistent, he ceases to see the boy standing next to him. Abraham's personality, his desires, values, and commitments disappears in the moment God penetrates his consciousness. So that's the danger that we see in this story. And again, it doesn't really have much to do with ending child sacrifice or human sacrifice or anything like that. It's really, again, according to these commentaries, these more contemporary commentaries, about not being intoxicated by your own beliefs.
Great. Thank you, Jonathan. Susan Rubin comments that she always thought the vision of the angel was Abraham's unconscious mind telling him to stop. I wonder if it's a battle of the voices in his head. One says do this, one says stop.
Yeah.
Which one do you listen to? The whole question of conscience is an interesting one. I did want to highlight one other detail in the text near the end that we had promised to touch on, where at the very end of the story, Abraham gets this blessing. And then it says in verse 19, Abraham then returned to his servants, and they left together for Beersheba. Who's missing there? There's no Isaac. So the question is Isaac assumed? Is Isaac pissed off and went the other way? Or is this a remnant of a version of the story where Abraham did sacrifice Isaac and proved his faith? Just like the firstborn of the animals you sacrifice for the hopes of getting more. Maybe this was a version of it. And one of our rabbis in our movement, Samach wrote a book called When Abraham Killed Isaac, talking about that version of the story. Might have been the older version, and the newer version came in with a bit of that agenda of, at least minimizing or reducing child sacrifice with the last minute reprieve. You wind up with the circumcision as sort of a substitute mini sacrifice as opposed to the entire thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I'm glad you pointed that out. This is another thing that we can happen upon if we have this expansive, non dogmatic reading of the text. We can start to see quirks like that and understand that maybe there is something more going on here. Like you said, a version of the story where Isaac dies, we can critique the behavior of Abraham in both of the stories that we presented today without feeling any guilt or a need for repentance, right? Because these are stories, and stories are told and retold because they have stuff in there, maybe intentionally for us to discover, who knows? But we certainly have a habit of doing that.
And on the literary level, this is one of my favorite pieces. When I first took my first class in biblical Hebrew, the professor pointed out that biblical narratives tend not to use emotion very much. They talk about someone who was in love, but they don't use happy and sad and, and he whispered, and that's not how they tend to work. It's very sort of fact-based narration. But this story evokes a tremendous amount of emotion because when Abraham and Isaac are talking to each other, they keep repeating, B'ni, my son, Avi, my father, my son, my father, like just highlighting the unnaturalness of this moment that has been caused by whatever the voice was that did it. It really is a masterclass in minimalist narration to evoke the kind of emotional tension. And there's even a moment where Abraham has Isaac bound up on the altar. And by the way, in Jewish life, it's called the binding of Isaac, but not the sacrifice of Isaac. If you look into European art, it's often called the sacrifice of Isaac, but he wasn't actually sacrificed. It's thought of as prefiguring another father willing to sacrifice his son in the Jesus story. But in the binding of Isaac story, Abraham binds Isaac, he puts him on the altar, and then it's almost like it's slow motion. He reaches forth his hand and he grabs the knife and he stretches out his arm as if to slay his. So it's like slowing, by describing those steps, it's slowing down the action for the angel to show up at the last minute. So again, that's the phrasing, the narration really has a powerful piece to it. We had a question about other resources for humanistic Jewish commentary and approaches to Torah essays, and I wanted to highlight actually two places you can go. The first is on the International Institute's website. We have an adult learning section that has all variety of topics, and one of them is Bible/Torah. And from there, you'll find a list of essays by one of our founding thinkers, Rabbi Sherwin Wine, a conference that we held on archaeology in the Bible, a textbook we have on how to explore this. It's aimed for sixth graders, but a lot of adults get a lot out of it too. We have a book that was a product of that colloquium conference that we held. We have a video playlist of Torah portion discussions, and I think we have about 3/4 of them covered at this point. And you'll see a variety of voices and a lot of me, but not only me, commenting on specific Torah portions. So you can always take a look and see if there's one there. And there's also some programs from the Congregation for Humanistic Judaism in that library with the Torah scroll there. And the second thing I was going to reference, this year, the Society for Humanistic Judaism is running a series with different rabbis and leaders in our movement commenting on particular Torah portions. It's not specifically related to the Torah portion of the week for that week, but it is us exploring specific Torah narratives and so on. That's a members-only program for people who are members of the Society for Humanistic Judaism. Their website is IISHJ.org, but you can even join just as an online member for a relatively cheap amount, and then you'll get access to those live programs, or they'll wind up on the SHJ's YouTube channel, and you can certainly find the videos there later with some more humanistic Torah commentaries. I hope you enjoyed this exploration of how humanistic Jews approach the Torah generally, but also specifically how we dive into a particular text. Different rabbis would have done it differently. This is how we do it. And I think even more importantly, this is how humanistic Jews find the text interesting. It's our Torah too. It's not just their Torah, either the ancestors or the most religious. This belongs to all Jews as an inheritance. But just like any inheritance, we are not museum curators who have to preserve it in amber and keep it exactly the same forever. It is ours to take and grapple with and interpret and read and reread and argue with and celebrate. Each person is going to inherit their inheritance differently. What I get from my great aunt's attic, I might keep some things, my sister might keep different things, neither of us might keep some things and reject it, but it's all ours, that inheritance, even the skeletons in our closet. So I think that this is a great example, this Torah portion, of the good and the bad, the highs and the lows, but also the complexity of having a mature relationship with your inheritance. When you're 5 years old, you think your parents know everything. When you're 15 years old, you're convinced your parents know absolutely nothing. And when you get a little older, a little more mature, maybe 25, 35, you learn that your parents had some wisdom and they made some mistakes. They were human beings and they weren't perfect. And you learn from what they've given you as best you can. That's the kind of relationship humanistic Jews have with Jewish heritage broadly and the Torah specifically, that it's a mature relationship where we're allowed to disagree, we're allowed to have our own opinions, and yet we can still learn some things from those insights into the human condition.